So, I'm not a good Indian. Good Indians, accompany the settlers and show them, hey, we can help you. Here's a deer. And that's the good Indian. And I'm not that. The bad Indian is somebody who's like, hey, why don't you, join with us and work for justice?
Right.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. I am joined today by Sarah Augustine, who is a Pueblo Tewa descendant. She's a founder and co-chair of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery and executive director of the Dispute Resolution Center of Yakima and Kittitas. I practiced those words and I probably said it wrong anyways. I'm so sorry. The Yakima, and Kittitas. Did I say it right?
You did. You got it.
Oh
you nailed it.
I'm like sweating a little bit. She's also the co-founder of Suriname Indigenous Health Fund, where she has advocated for vulnerable Indigenous people since 2004. She has represented the interests of Indigenous community partners to their own governments, the Inter-American Development Bank, the United Nations, the Organization of American States Inter-American Commissions on Human Rights, the World Health Organization, and a host of other international actors, including corporate interests. Wow, that is an incredible sentence. She's currently a columnist for Anabaptist World and co-hosts the Doctrine of Discovery podcast with Sherry Hostetler. I listened to an episode and I highly recommend that people go check it out. She and her husband, Dan Peplow, and their son live in the Yakima Valley of Washington. She is author of the book, which we are talking about today, The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus in Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. I'm very excited to talk with you about the book. I was hoping to finish it before we started this podcast, but I didn't. But I was taking a ton of notes, and so it really slowed me down because I just felt like every other sentence, like I wanted to cement it into my brain, so I remembered it. So I was like rewriting your book in my notes.
And thank you.
Yeah, it's I highly recommend. The Doctrine of Discovery was not something I learned about till seminary, maybe. Like it was just not part of our education. I feel late. I was gonna say late to the game, which sounds flippant, but that's not what I mean. I feel like I have catching up to do, I guess is what I should say. So we're talking about your book that was just released. And as usual on our podcast, let's start by going over our definitions. So would you be willing to describe what the Doctrine of Discovery is? Just a little simple question.
Yeah, and thanks, Mariah. I also just want to comment on what you said before. The Doctrine of Discovery is not taught anywhere that I know about. I'm amazed you learned about it in seminary. That's pretty awesome. It is definitely something that has been sort of erased and ignored. I shouldn't say erased because it's still the law, but has been ignored and sort of just glossed over in all of our systems. And I think the people in the dominant culture who benefit from it, it's just not in their best interest to know about it. And so it's not something that is really taught or talked about. And so the Doctrine of Discovery is a system of laws and policies that have worked over 500 years to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. So in a nutshell, the Doctrine of Discovery, it's called a doctrine. It's a legal doctrine. And it's a precedent in the United States that Supreme Courts and lower courts make decisions based upon it. But in a nutshell, what it meant was in the early days, of discovering the new world. So I use that word discovery very loosely. That is to say, European states had developed the technology to leave Europe and go seek fortune in other lands. And the Catholic Church set a system of laws to determine which European state would be allowed to claim what territory. So it's really the doctrine of first discovery, which European state gets to have complete control of a land because it discovered it first. So in those days, it was a race for which European power would be able to amass the most land and wealth and resources. And so that's what the doctrine of discovery is. It's a legal doctrine that defines which European state gets to claim which land.
The introduction of your book reads, Indigenous peoples have been systematically disenfranchised and dispossessed as a matter of church policy for 500 years by United States policy for 240 years. And Christianity has been tied to the doctrine of discovery since its birth. So how do you see the relationship between Christianity and also like the culture of domination that kind of bred this doctrine?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, that is a deep philosophical question there, and I will give it my best shot. So, you know, and I want to begin by just saying, being really clear that I am a Christian, and I take that faith really seriously. I would say it's my primary identity is as a Christian Indigenous woman, and so there is a narrative in Christian doctrine that explains who is entitled, who is affirmed, and who is not. And I would say, I mean, you know, I'm going to put it in my own words. There are theologians who've kind of put it in more, you know, probably more sophisticated terms. There's kind of a narrative of empire, and then a different narrative that is the narrative of Jesus, you know. And so anyway, I think this narrative of empire has been weaponized in the doctrine of discovery. So just quickly, it's kind of a three-leg stool from my point of view within Christian dogma, which is, first of all, that the state is empowered by God. This comes from Romans chapter 10. And so people are in authority, are put there by God, and nobody should resist those things, because if you oppose those things, then you're opposing God's authority. So that's one thing, and that's this belief in authority as ordained by God. So the next one would be covenantal Exodus story, which is from the Hebrew story. I want to be really clear to talk about. It's from the Hebrew tradition, but the way that Christians have sort of weaponized that narrative is different. And so this story says that God's chosen people, which is the children of Israel, were empowered to flee Egypt and go into the promised land. And it had been ordained that land would belong to them. And they were empowered to vanquish and subdue and et cetera, basically kill everybody that was there because they were God's people. And so the logic is that with the coming of Christ, God's chosen people becomes the church. And so the church is empowered to go and subdue and destroy and kill people that are living in their promised land. And so you actually see this in the settlement of the United States in religious language, talking about, oh, we're coming into this promised land that was promised to us by God, a manifest destiny. The whole continent will be controlled by the United States, and that is preordained by God. God has ordained that because we are morally just, and we are empowered to do that. And so we see that, you know, I would say in the inauguration prayer during President Trump's inauguration, all of that language was used. This is sort of American exceptionalism, right? We are exceptional, and we are empowered to go and subdue other states around the world because God has empowered us to do that. So that sort of Exodus story that has been politicized and is its own dogma now. And then the third thing is the Great Commission has been repurposed, you know, to go into all nations. And so we have this vehicle, we have this pronouncement that we are empowered as Christians to go into all nations and to, basically make disciples, of all people. And that, so the logic in the doctrine of discovery, the original papal bulls, is that if you resist, as we're coming into your territory, if you resist, then God has empowered us to kill you and take everything that you have and enslave you. And so, although those early documents, are long gone and that they've been covered over with precedent, in our secular country today, the law is still based on this understanding that whoever was the first discoverer, European state, had the right and continues to have the right to control and own all of that territory, and that the original people, the first people, lost that right. And so, sort of the Christian logic at the time was anybody that was not ruled by a Christian monarch was not a real human being. I think a lot of people say, "Oh man, I can't believe that. That's so terrible." But if you look into your own theology, these stories are there. I mean, if you go to, especially as it pertains to mission, if you go to the Billy Graham Museum, the very first display is the Europeans coming to the New World and bringing the gospel to the Indians. That's the very first display. And in the original Supreme Court ruling, the Marshall decision that really put the doctrine of discovery into U.S. law, it said that, the just compensation to the Indians was civilization and Christianity. They were justly compensated for the loss of all of their lands and wealth because they were provided Christianity. So it's very much still a part of core beliefs in Christian dogma, I would say.
Right. Yeah. The justification for it's like this kind of, I see on TikTok a lot, the comment, there's no hate quite like Christian love or something like that.
My goodness.
How Christians historically and today do things out of this kind of sense of righteousness, like that this is good for you. I know what is good for you. I know how to save you. And I'm going to go to these extremes in order to do what's best for you because you don't know what is best for you. How can you know what is best for you? Because your whatever is not God ordained. And so it's like, I kind of wonder, I don't know. I have this theory, it's probably not my own, that no one ever does bad things thinking yes, this is a bad thing and I want to do this bad thing. I think we have this way of justifying our actions and somehow doing things thinking that it's the right thing to do or thinking that it's okay somehow through our way of justifying. And not as an excuse for awful actions, but I don't know. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
Yeah. I appreciate what you're saying. What I've heard that called, ideological alibis. I'm going to do what I want and I'm going to come up with an alibi to explain, why that's okay to do that. And I think in the case of the settlement of the U.S. and even in the valley where I live right now, I live in a reservation, the homeland of the Yakama Nation, people continue to justify these things by saying, well, we're going to take this land because nobody's doing anything with it. We're going to continue to do this because the people who live here don't deserve it. We're better than them. We're morally superior to them, which is just racism, right? But as that's happening, it feels really just. You know what I mean? That this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's super interesting. My next question that I'm curious about is about the residential schools. But I realized we haven't talked about our drinks, so I thought, maybe we'll just take a break, have a refresher, and talk about our drinks, and then we can dive into some troubling stuff. But yeah, what are you drinking today, Sarah?
Yeah, I always drink the same thing every day, and I'll tell you, it's my favorite, and it's chai tea. It's actually brand specific. It's Oregon chai tea with almond milk.
Okay. Is it hot or iced?
It's hot.
You have it in a thermos, so.
I'll tell you, my son, Micah, says, if we're in the Sahara Desert, my mom is still drinking that drink hot. It's so true. Even, I like coffee too, but I don't drink caffeine anymore. And so, I only drink coffee hot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why.
I'm also, it's hot. I mean, I'm in a tank top or a summer dress, and I'm also drinking hot coffee. So I'm with you on that. And my mug is just like white with a like blue rim. I joke like every time on this podcast that I just like want to see people's mugs and, no, I don't know. I just think coffee.
Look at the size of this thing.
Yeah.
And
do you fill it up?
Oh, all the way to the top. Yeah. I fill it all the way up. It's mainly almond milk. It's just comforting. I just think it's comforting to have a warm drink in my hand. I don't know why that I'm like that. So, and I kind of, I'm a sipper.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to drink it.
Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast, so I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. But yeah, we've been hearing recently in the news about residential schools. And, as a podcast that talks about Christianity, like it would feel negligent to not talk about the relationship between Christianity and the role that they played in residential schools in the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. So do you want to go into how you address that in your book?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is that there was a law that was passed in 1819. It was called the BIA, or Bureau of Indian Affairs Civilization Fund Act. And that law, what happened was Congress put religious institutions, sort of empowered them to take over the agencies of Indigenous people on reservations. And this including boarding schools. And so religious societies, these boarding schools went on through, the 1970s and 80s. So, and many people don't realize that there were boarding schools that were still in operation, in my generation, where I live now in the Yakima Reservation. Most of the people my age went to boarding school. So think of all the generations of people who went to boarding school. And so the idea was that if you remove children from their homes, they would have a better shot of assimilation. In the context of the people where I now live in the Yakima Reservation, the logic was we wanted to remove children. I mean, not me, but the writers of these original laws said we want to remove children from their barbarous influences. So if their parents are barbarians, we want to remove them from that so that we can try and train them how to be, good citizens. And so, of course, American Indians didn't become citizens until the 1920s in the United States. This is far in advance of that. Still, beginning in 1819, the federal government is putting money aside for religious organizations to take over the education of children. And so the process of putting kids in boarding schools originally, there were arrest warrants. The authorities could come in, take children, depending on where and what the situation was in that context. And often children didn't see their parents for years. This went on in the Alaska Territory, almost longer than anywhere else, I want to say. And, children would return home to their homes at the end of their boarding school experience and not be able to survive in their native environment because they didn't have the skills to do that. You have to learn how to live, in difficult environments. it was not uncommon for kids to not be able to talk to their parents because they were not allowed to speak their tribal language or their native language in the school. So they would no longer even be able to communicate with their parents. And so another thing that isn't really talked about as much, I think, is the kind of abuse that went on there. I mean, there was corporal punishment for sure. If you read the report in the Canadian residential schools, something like nearly half of all survivors, people who've lived, who are still alive, who went to boarding school, nearly half of them were assaulted sexually while they were in boarding school. The United States doesn't have records. We didn't keep records in the same way that Canada has done, but it's just an extremely traumatic experience for children to be taken away from their families and basically taught that everything that their parents were and their whole community was wrong and bad and backward, and that they had to become some other thing. And I want to just really explore that, how twisted that is, because, no matter how good you can be at imitating, the dominant culture, racism will make it so that you are never going to be accepted by that dominant culture, right? And so you've learned that everything that you are and all of your traditions are wrong and bad and backward and evil, but you're never going to be able to really be a member of the dominant culture. And that is a really twisted part of assimilation, I would say, to this day, because, I consider myself to be, somewhat accomplished, and, I have gone to school and graduate school and, amassed some, status, I guess you would say, in my career, but nobody is ever fooled into believing that I'm white. I mean, I still deal with all of the impact of being walking in this body through this world, and I'll be honest with you, Mariah, I know this sounds cheesy and it feels like it's a very small thing in the context of boarding schools, but when I go to Joanne Fabric, are you familiar? If I go to a quilting store, I quilt. I'm a Mennonite woman. I quilt like everyone does. And when I go to the fabric stores, I am often followed. People just assume I'm going to be, like stealing stuff in there. It's not uncommon, especially Christmas time when stores are really crowded, for someone to just follow me through the store. And it's like, I'm 48 years old. I'm a grandmother.
I'm just trying to quilt. Let me quilt in peace.
So, I mean, and so what I'm trying to say is that that's me, a person of privilege. I'm not trying to equate that experience with the experience of going through boarding school. But what I do want to say is that no matter how good you are at taking on the mantle of the dominant culture, you are never going to be accepted, because that is the core of white supremacy, right? And trying to navigate a society where white supremacy is the core sort of value system or belief system that is threaded through all the institutions. So you have children who have been removed from what public health calls protective factors. So language, culture, extended family, these are the things that protect a youth or a child from substance abuse, shortened life expectancy, chronic stress, trauma. And you take a person, you remove them from all of those protective factors, tell them that everything they are is wrong, and then thrust them into the world. What do you expect happens? I mean, you have all kinds of trauma that results from that. In fact, entire communities are traumatized. You have traumatized people then having families of their own and raising families as they're traumatized, sending their own children to boarding school. Yeah, it's a cycle of deep destruction.
Yeah, it stood out to me, one story of a kid who kept waiting for their parents to come get them and didn't understand why they were there, and kept waiting and waiting for like this rescue, and that didn't come, and the more they waited and hoped, the more bitter they grew. And yeah, just like such a recipe for trauma, and I'm sure that turns into generational trauma. And then another story that stood out to me was that they like burned their like furs and like the clothing that was like actually suited to keeping them warm in harsh northern environments, and then gave them like clothing that was insufficient, and so they were more exposed to the elements because their clothing was considered
barbaric.
Yeah.
So that story was shared with me by Willie Littlechild, who's one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And, his story is that when he was brought into boarding school, all of the furs that had been made for him by his mother all the kids were stripped of that stuff. It was burned in a big pile, and they were given cotton clothing, which is, insufficient to survive in the North Country. So this, it's a process of it's humiliation and, stripping away a person's identity. And then there's nothing to go back to. Of course your community is still there, but the intact community, the whole goal is to make that community unviable. And what is the purpose of that? We have all these ideological alibis, right? Like why we're justified in doing this, but the actual purpose is to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands, because that land is desirable. And that hasn't changed. That continues to this day. It's true in the United States and Canada. It's true in Mexico, where the Mayan people are trying to remain on their native territories, the Yucatan Peninsula. It's being invaded by monocropping, using genetically modified foods. It's true for the Wayana and Suriname, whose lands are being invaded by gold mining. Around the globe, Indigenous peoples are under attack, not because there's sort of a logic of this sort of benevolence, we want to bring you things, but because their land is desirable, and there is a desire for them to no longer exist, so that their resources can be taken by others. And that was the whole purpose of Manifest Destiny also. To remove Indigenous people from their lands. We have a legal system that makes that possible, and we have a religious system of thought that justifies it.
Yeah, that reminded me about how like the draw to the promised land was that it was this like resource-rich land, that it was a land flowing in milk and honey, and that God had this promised land, this beautiful rich land for the people, and that's what like kept them going. Is they're like, oh yes, all these resources, but like in the title of your book, the land was not empty. Like there were people living there, but they thought that this was God ordained, that that God was giving them this land and all the resources.
Yeah, and it's very true in the Mennonite story too. As people were, felt they were fleeing persecution in Europe, and many people came through Russia and then came down through Canada and the US, they also felt that finally they're able to relax in this land, and it has been provided to them by God for their faithfulness. And yes, of course, the military is removing Indigenous people and putting them in, what are essentially concentration camps, so that Mennonite settlers and other settlers are able to live in abundance.
Yeah. One thing that stood out to me, and this came up when I asked you to be on the podcast, you describe yourself in the book as a bad Indian, and so I'm curious what you mean by that.
Yes, this is a little bit personal. I'm happy to talk with you about it. I think in my life as a brown woman, living in this body, in this country we live in together, our society, there are a lot of assumptions people make about what it means to be Indigenous, and so I'll get things for a long time, not just recently, about, hey, do you want to come and smudge on International Indigenous Peoples Day? Do you want to sing a song in your native language? It's like, it's sort of like being like the person who's gonna, come and it's like Indian magic.
Yeah.
And there's some like mysticism that goes with that. It's like this, it's like this extra, this special sort of, it's like my Indian wizard friend, you know what I mean? And so, you're right. It's like, hey,
Yeah.
come and, say the, I don't remember any Harry Potter spells, but I'm trying to think of some of those words like,
Wingardium Leviosa.
yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, and, by the way, come in your regalia and with moccasins and stuff. It's like, I am never going to do that stuff. I am not going to invite you to join my tribe or make a special Indian name for you. Like, I don't know. So I often think, yeah, I'm a really bad Indian because I'm not going to do any of that stuff. But what I am going to do is ask you to seek justice and peace, I guess, to make good on your commitment as a Christian to do that, and I do think that's bad. I do think it's sort of like this troubling sort of, thorn in the paw. It's like, yeah, we're going to ask Sarah to come and then she's going to make us feel bad. So, I'm not a good Indian. Good Indians, accompany the settlers and show them, hey, we can help you. Here's a deer. Here's like, here, let me give you this, salve for your weary soul. And that's the good Indian. And I'm not that. The bad Indian is somebody who's like, hey, why don't you, like join with us and work for justice?
Right.
This sort of, squeaky wheel of a cry for not only justice, I think that's true, but commitment to Christ and the mandate of Jesus. Yeah. I guess what I would say is that's what makes me a bad Indian, is that I'm always pushing and I never leave it alone. I never sort of back off or take a breath or back down. And that's irritating.
It's irritating in the way that like you're saying, the thorn in the paw, like it tells you something is wrong. It tells you that something needs to be changed before you can move forward. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say in your response to like your like good Indian, bad Indian thing, it made me think about how the narrative that I have been told about like Indians, I say in quotes, was kind of like what you were saying, that they were like helpful, and that there was like this peaceful first Thanksgiving, and the Native Americans were like sharing their bounty and trying to make friends. And then we would have a day in our school where Native Americans would come and, dress to the nines in their traditional outfits and play drums and music and dance. And like, I still remember the feeling of the drum, like in my body, like it was like a visceral reaction. I thought it was so incredibly beautiful. But I realize now that it kind of painted this image of like, because they held up all this, like all the good Indian stuff without talking about all the harm that was done. And also kind of relegated it to the past. Like, this doesn't exist anymore. This is like a monument to what was before, rather than acknowledging that like Native and Indigenous people exist today. Like, it's not like an extinct species or something like that. So yeah, those things kind of, it seems like it goes hand in hand, the like good Indian, pushing the good Indian narrative without the conflict. And then also like relegating it all to the past, and the harm too, like, oh, well, that was a long time ago, kind of drawing it back to what we were saying in the beginning about the doctrine of discovery, that it's still harming people now. But yeah.
George Tinker has said, the way to repair harm is to return land. A critical way of repairing harm is to return land. And I guess the reason I bring that up is because, what he's, very succinctly saying, much more succinctly than me, is that the removal of Indigenous people from their land is ongoing. And that it is still a priority. It's still a priority at the federal level. And there's still national policy in place to make that a reality. And so you can't turn back until you stop that. I mean, that has to stop. And so I appreciate what you're saying in terms of, there are still Native people that exist, and they are still under attack.
On kind of a similar note to the bad Indian question, I ask everyone who comes on the show, what would you say if to someone who said that you were like a bad Christian because of all these things you're shouting through your megaphone, of all the ways you're making people, you know, rightfully uncomfortable? Like, how would you respond to that?
Oh, it happens all the time. In fact, my mom's, you know, I lost her 9 years ago. So it's been a while. I mean, she used to say, how can you call yourself a pacifist when all you do is cause trouble? What I have said before, and this is just smarty pants. This is just smarty pants response. Like, I know it's smarty pants and I can't help it. And I'll just say, hey, you know what? Don't talk to me. Talk to the one who sent me.
And you talk in your book a lot about being on the side of life. And I thought like what you said was like so beautiful and hopeful. So can you go into that?
Yeah. So for me, you know, I think about this as our world, the earth is a closed system, right? So there isn't anything coming into it or going out from it. And reality is defined by that system. So what I mean by that is you have to have oxygen, you know, at a certain level. You know, you got to have clean air to breathe. You got to have clean water to drink. You got to have soil that's going to be able to grow food. And our world right now, our culture, especially the dominant culture in the United States and in the Western world, is really committed to destroying all of those systems. So, you know, these reductive systems of extractive industry and oppression and subjugation, these systems are run counter to the logic of life. And that's not because I said that, that's because it's evident in creation. And these systems that have been put in place, these extractive, reductive systems, are running counter to that, to life. Aligning oneself with those systems of oppression and death has one outcome only, and that is death. And I don't mean death for the self, because we're all going to die. I mean death for our closed system. And choosing to be on the side of life is choosing to be on the side of all of those systems that produce life. And so this is where, you know, you were talking about that theologian, this is at a World Council of Churches meeting, who basically said, you know, we can't, Sarah, you know, we can't be stuck on your one issue because the piece is much bigger than your one issue. And I said, we are not an issue. We are a people with a message of hope for humanity, a message of hope for humanity, because however you're conceiving of peace, we as Indigenous people are conceiving of peace as the restoration of this closed system that we are all dependent on to live. And how do we know that that's right? That is the spirit of life. That's the spirit of God among us. How do we know that? You know, Romans 1 tells us that actually that the spirit of God is evident in the creation around us. And if you're aligning yourself with those systems that would seek to suppress it and subdue it, whose side are you on? You know, I mean, that's crazy. It runs counter to the mandate of Jesus. And so I think it can feel very alienating to say, no, I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm not going to be a part of that stuff, because all of that stuff is about empire building and subjugation and death. And I want no part of that. I am going to live my life on the side of life. And I'm going to give my life to that. And I think, you know, the story that I heard when I was growing up, going to Sunday school and whatnot was, you know, God has a plan for your life. And I just would just reframe that in my life now and say, God, the spirit of life, the great animator, the ancient of days, has a plan. How am I going to use my life to be part of that plan? What is that plan? It's the plan of creation. It's evident around us. And how am I going to use my life to be part of that? That's what I want to do. It's all I want to do. It's all I want to do. It's what we're made to do. And I'm going to reject that other stuff, you know? And so, you know, another thing I would just say too, is that it feels like, oh, you know, the forces are so big and so bad, you know, capitalism and commerce and blah, blah, blah. It's like, man, that stuff is doomed. It is not fit with reality. You know, this reality we live in is a closed system, folks. It is not open to interpretation. Oh, you destroy the systems that we need to live, you destroy life. That's all there is to it. And those are doomed. They cannot prosper. They cannot be successful. We have really short lifespans. So it feels like, man, you know, they're going to defeat us. So that's impossible. Life will prevail. Whether our species gets to be a part of that is what we get to decide. But I guess my point is, I want to be on that team. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to be on that part for life, because that's what is nourishing and encouraging. And, you know, I just remember this Psalm, return, O Lord, how long? Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. And that is it. I mean, that is the steadfast love that I receive in the morning, the animation to continue. And I guess there's just one more, and that is that trust in the Lord and do good, and you will live in the land and prosper. Commit your ways to him, and he will give you the desires of your heart. He will make your justice shine like the noonday sun. I think that's it. You know, the desires of my heart. Is the desire of my heart security and wealth and prosperity? Is that the desire of my heart? It isn't, because when I'm on the side of life, the desire of my heart is life. It is the will of the one, the creator of the universe.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, for all of that. I feel like this is a really weird analogy, but I feel like what you said is like the equivalent of like eating like a really nourishing, good meal that just like fuels your body. I don't know if that made any sense, but that's where my brain went. So
thank you.
Yeah. You know, do you have any final advice for Indigenous folks who are learning to reconcile their traditions and roots within Christianity or their sense of like faith?
I would say for Indigenous people who are trying to grapple with this, the first thing is you are enough, and you are valid. You don't need credentials to be Native. You're okay exactly the way that you are. And you know, when I was trying to figure all of this out, and of course I'm still trying to figure it out, but you know, I went to this this elder that I don't even have the right to. Well, I had no right to him, but I went and asked him for help anyway. And that's Stan McKay, who is an elder of the Cree people of Canada and an international kind of rock star. We happened to be at a meeting together, and I imposed on him, just said, I need help me. What do I do? You know, I'm in personal crisis. I don't know how to do this. And I don't know how to be an Indian. I don't know anything. And he was like, okay, you need to go back to your home place, the land that your grandmother walked on, and be healed by the water there. And that's what he said. And that was the beginning of the journey for me, and sort of reclaiming my identity. And I'm not telling you that that's what you should do. What I'm saying is to return to the elders, because they will tell you and give you wise counsel. And it's okay to just ask people in your sphere, what should I do? I mean, and I have faith that the Spirit will speak through them. That's the way Indigenous people have done it since the beginning of time. And so they're out there. You have to look around sometimes. Wherever Indigenous people are, there are elders, and ask them for help.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Traditionally, we end our time on the podcast with a blessing. So would it be okay if I bless you and all I've started calling the people who listen to their podcast baddies.
I love it.
So all you, so yeah, would it be okay if I give a blessing?
That would be awesome.
Okay. Sarah and all you baddies out there, may you go today fed and nourished by the words that I believe God spoke through Sarah. May you be energized to go and pursue the side of life. May you go with energy and focus and determination to be on that side, the side of green goodness, soil, water, air, all of those things. Amen.
Thank you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining. It's been a blessing to have you.
You bet. And thank you for inviting me and for introducing yourself to me, Mariah. Let's be friends.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Let's please be friends. That would be great. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.